Nobody expected what happened that night. It was supposed to be just another televised speech. President Cyril Ramaphosa addressing the nation about South Africa's place in the African Union. Government officials were ready. News anchors had their summaries prepared. Across the country, life slowed down. Taxi drivers turned up their radios. Teachers gathered students around old TVs. Even in quiet townships, people paused to listen. But inside that studio, something didn't feel right as the cameras began to roll. A plain white envelope sat on the president's desk, sealed with red wax. No markings, no name. No one knew where it came from. Ramaphosa stared at it longer than he should have. His face looked tight, his hands still. Something had already shaken him and he hadn't even opened it yet. Then he spoke softly. "This was handed to me just minutes ago," he said, holding up the envelope. "It's from Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso." The entire studio went silent. The control room froze. On social media, live comment sections lit up. Who is Traoré? What did he send? Ramaphosa broke the seal and opened the letter. The moment his eyes met the first line, everything changed. His breath caught, couldn't get the words out. He tried again, voice cracking, hands shaking. For the first time in a long time, the people of South Africa saw something they'd never seen from their president. He began to cry. Not the kind of tears you hide. Not for cameras, but real human tears that say, "Something deep just hit me." So what was in that letter? Why did it crush one of Africa's most powerful men in front of millions? Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just shake a president, it stirred an entire continent. The letter wasn't filled with fancy language or political talk. It didn't carry titles or orders. It began with a simple line that didn't sound like something from a president. It sounded like something from a man who couldn't sleep. "I do not write to you as a president," it said, "but as a son of Africa who finds no rest at night." That was how it started, and from that moment, everything shifted. Ibrahim Traoré's words didn't come dressed in diplomatic language. They came raw, open, heavy with pain. He spoke of children starving in places like Lasso, of teenagers risking their lives in boats, hoping to reach Europe only to be thrown back or swallowed by the sea. He mentioned mothers in Kaka who cry alone at night because they have nothing left to feed their children. And he asked again and again how leaders could stay quiet while all this pain continues. He wasn't talking about numbers or policies. He was talking about real people. His people. Our people. Then came the line that cracked Ramaphosa's voice in half. He read it, then stopped. He tried again, but nothing came out. "If we, the ones with power, sleep peacefully while our people suffer," the letter read, "then we are not leaders. We are the final betrayal." You could hear the air leave the room. Ramaphosa stood there, shaking. His hands clutched the paper, but it was his face that told the truth. His eyes welled up. One tear rolled down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He didn't try to hide it. Back home, people watching on TV were no different. Some gasped, others cried. Not out of shock, but because someone had finally said what they'd been feeling for years. The internet exploded. Hashtag letter of truth. Hashtag AfricaWake. Clips were shared millions of times within hours. But this wasn't just a viral moment. This was something else. In classrooms, teachers paused lessons to play the video. In health clinics, nurses streamed the broadcast for patients in the waiting area. In street markets, vendors passed around printed copies. One teacher in Durban said softly, "I don't think the children will forget this day." And they didn't single quotes. Teens began drawing pictures of Ibrahim Traoré, not in military gear, but as a man holding a letter. Some of them wrote words under the drawings. He remembers us. Journalists who had spent years covering dry press conferences were now crying on live broadcasts. One veteran anchor whispered, "I have never seen this country stop like this, not for anything." Elders in rural villages compared it to the days of Mandela. "We haven't heard truth like this since then," one man said. And back then, we were marching. It wasn't just South Africa. In Nigeria, in Ghana, in Kenya, people watched. The footage on their phones, on borrowed TVs, on radios crackling with weak signals. But the message still landed. Clear, heavy, deep. The pain in Traoré's voice didn't belong to one country. It belonged to all of Africa. What made it even more powerful was that it didn't come from a speechwriter. It came from a man who sounded like he'd carried this weight alone for far too long and could no longer stay quiet. He said the things that presidents don't usually say. He pointed a finger, not at outsiders, but inward at leaders, at power, at the silence that's allowed so much suffering to continue. And people felt it. Artists in Cape Town painted murals of the moment Ramaphosa cried. In Lagos, street poets recited parts of the letter. In marketplaces across the continent, people started talking not about gossip or politics, but about the kind of future they wanted for their children. A mother of 3 in Kitcha recorded a short video. It went viral in under an hour. "I have never seen a president cry," she said. "But when he read that letter, I cried too. Because for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone finally saw me." That's what the letter did. It made people feel seen. Not as voters or workers, or numbers in a report, but as humans. As sons and daughters of Africa who've waited for someone to say, "Enough." What started as a sealed envelope became something else entirely. It became a mirror. One that forced every leader and every citizen to stop and ask, what are we doing? Who have we become? And maybe most important of all, what are we waiting for? The letter was no longer just a message. It had turned into something alive. It was a wave, and it was still rising. It's Friday, 8 p.m. Everywhere from Cape Town to Accra, people waited. No one spoke much. They just stared at their screens, held their breath, and hoped whatever came next would matter. Then the screen lit up. There was no music, no dramatic voiceover, no flags waving behind a podium. Instead, a man appeared, simple, still, and steady. No military uniform, no medals. Just a plain African shirt with rolled sleeves. It was Captain Ibrahim Traoré. But tonight, he wasn't standing as a soldier. He was standing as a son of the continent. He looked straight into the camera and said, to every mother who has gone to sleep with an empty stomach, to every father who left home chasing a job that was never there, to every child who believes they must leave Africa to be valued, you were never forgotten. That line hit hard. Not because it was loud, but because it was true. Then his voice softened, and he began to tell a story he had never shared before. When I was 14, he said, I saw my neighbor collapse in the street. His daughter ran to find help. There was no doctor, no ambulance, only dust and silence. He died in her arms. His wife screamed. I still remember that sound. He paused. He was not a president, not a rebel. He was just African. But no one reported it. No headline, no hashtag. Because African pain does not go viral. In living rooms, in crowded buses, in small bars with crackling TVs, people began to cry. Men who hadn't cried in years wiped their faces. A girl in Uganda tweeted, "He is speaking for every one of us. Traoré didn't he? Stop there." He leaned in a little closer and asked the question no one had dared to say out loud. What if the real poverty is not in our wallets, but in our unity? He let the silence settle, then continued. If Africa is to rise, he said slowly, We must stop waiting, because no one is coming. And the truth is, no one ever was. You could hear hearts break across the continent. But what came next felt like history being written in real time. He reached under the desk and lifted a thick document bound, sealed, and stamped. You could see the weight of it in his hands. "This," he said, "is my proposal." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words carried their own power. A Pan-African coalition. 10 nations, no foreign aid, no strings. Shared education, shared defense. One goal, dignity. For a moment, the world went still. Then the reactions came all at once. In Lagos, a bus driver pulled over and turned up the volume. In Nairobi, prison guards unlocked a TV room and let inmates listen. In Soweto, families crowded around a single phone. He was no longer just speaking. He was waking something up. Traoré stood firm and made one final vow. "I will not live forever." He said, "But if we build this together, Africa will." The screen slowly faded to black dot. Nobody clapped. Not because they didn't want to, but because their hands couldn't move. People were crying too hard. Some stood in silence. Others whispered prayers. In homes and shops and dusty schools, it felt like something sacred had just happened. The next morning, a photograph began to spread. It wasn't of Traoré. It was of a statue being built in Ouagadougou. A giant envelope torn open with stone birds, rising from it like they were flying into the sky. At the base, it read, "One letter, one continent, one dream." The letter had become something more than a message. It had become sacred in cities and villages alike. People began repeating the same phrase again and again on posters, on radios, in classrooms. "Let us build a great Africa." It was no longer just a line. It was a promise. Exactly 21 days after the letter shook the continent, President Cyril Ramaphosa walked once again into the same studio where it all began. Same lights, same desk, same cameras. But this time, he wasn't trembling. This time, there was no confusion in his voice, no fear in his hands. He looked straight into the camera and spoke calmly. "3 weeks ago, I opened a letter that broke. Something inside me, not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not attack me. He reminded me, reminded all of us, of the promises we buried under silence. Today, I'm here to South Africa accepts his invitation. We will stand as co-leaders in the Pan-African coalition." The moment those words left his mouth, the country erupted. In Johannesburg, people poured into the streets. Cars honked. Children waved homemade flags. At a high school in Cape Town, students stood up and began to chant in unison. In the markets of Durban, women raised their hands and shouted, "No more crumbs. We bake our own bread now." And in a small classroom in Limpopo, a girl drew a map of Africa with no lines. No borders, just one land, one name, home. At the bottom of the page, she wrote, "One people, one dream." That same morning, a letter arrived on Ramaphosa's desk. It was from Zinzi Mandela, daughter of Nelson Mandela. She wrote, "I saw you cry on live television. But I didn't see weakness. I saw Mandela in you. And in Traoré, I saw the heartbeat of Africa." Tucked inside was a scanned page from one of her father's old journals. Near the bottom, written in fading ink, were the words, "One day, a young lion will rise in the West. He will not speak for power but for the voiceless. And when he speaks, Africa must listen." Not long after, 10 African presidents met in Ganunder, an open sky. No red carpets, no security details. Number? Pressed just a long wooden table in the grass. They called it the Unity Table. They didn't give speeches. They shared stories of villages that now had water, of children learning to read, of people waking up proud, not scared. Then Traoré stood up. "We are not here to sign a contract," he said. "We are here to make a promise." And that promise spread. Soon, schools across the continent were teaching the letter as part of history. Nurses whispered its lines to newborn babies. Artists painted murals of children holding hands with no flags between them. Then, one quiet morning, President Ramaphosa traveled to Burkina Faso. No media, no cameras, just him and Traoré walking side by side through a quiet garden. "You didn't just write a letter," Ramaphosa said, looking at the man beside him. "You rewrote history." Traoré smiled. "No, we all did." Later that year, a statue was unveiled in Ouagadougou, not of a man, not of a president, but of an envelope torn open with birds rising out of it. At the base, the words, "One letter, one continent, one dream." And somewhere, far from the speeches and cameras, a nurse leaned over a sleeping newborn and whispered, "You came at the right time. Africa is awake now. The journey is far from over." But something happened. Something. Real.Africa had remembered itself.